Spare. Angola. Harry explains that he travelled to Angola, a war-torn country, on an official visit, and he saw where daily life had been affected by landmines, including one town which he understood to be the most heavily mined place in all of Africa. It's now August 2013. He explains he wore the same protective gear that his mother had worn when she visited Angola on her historic trip. He even worked with the same charity, the Halo Trust. Apparently, however, that the scheme, the endeavour that Diana had launched had stalled. Lack of resources, lack of resolve. He explains that it was his mother's most passionate cause at the end. She'd been to Bosnia 3 weeks before she went to Paris in August 1997. And he recalls when she detonated a mine and explained there were 17 million to go. He was taking up her cause, but he felt that each day he was walking through a psychological, emotional minefield. He then did some more research. He was still being affected by his panic attacks, and he even spoke to his father about it, explaining that he was struggling. Charles sent him to the doctor, which Harry recognised was kind, but the doctor was a GP with no knowledge, and he just wanted to give him pills. Harry didn't want the pills. He then explained that he came across people recommending magnesium, which was said to have a calming effect. And it did, but in large quantities it also loosened the bowels, which apparently he learned the hard way at a mate's wedding. Perhaps I ought to have called this chapter Harry Shits Himself. Anyway, he then talks further with his father over dinner about this, and apparently Charles looks down at his plate and said softly, "I suppose it's my fault. I should have got you the help you needed years ago." Harry said that it wasn't his father's fault, but he appreciated the apology. Again, demonstrating his empathic nature, wrapped up in, of course, of all the hot-headedness, in terms of accepting what, of course, is false contrition. His father, of course, is making that observation now, years too late, and it's a form of false contrition because, of course, it's coming from a narcissist, and it's done to assert control over Harry in the moment to make it look like that Charles is contrite and apologetic for the situation that his son is in. But, of course, he hadn't done anything to remedy, hadn't noticed, hadn't looked after his well-being, looked into it, considered it at an earlier juncture, of course, commensurate with the absence of emotional empathy. Harry explained that come autumn, his anxiety was getting worse, and he put it down to the fact that he was coming to the end of his 20s, and he was beset by all manner of doubts and fears. Who is he? Where is he going? All of that. And, of course, there was this point about why won't he marry? Apparently, the press had dredged up every girl that he'd ever been seen with, and then hired supposed experts to try and make sense of it all. One detailed a flirtation with Cameron Diaz and reported that Harry just couldn't see himself with her, and Harry confirms that he couldn't because he'd never even met her. He'd never been within 50 metres of her. And he states further proof that if you like reading pure bollocks, then royal biographies are just your thing. He talks about the concept of marriage and the great controversies about kings and queens going back. And he explained that you weren't a fully vested member of the royal family until you were wed. And he said it was no coincidence that the Queen always started her speeches, "My husband and I." He said that when Willie and Kate married, they became a household, and therefore they became entitled to more staff, more cars, bigger home, grander office, extra resources, engraved letterheads. Harry says he doesn't care about such perks, but he did care about respect, and as a confirmed bachelor, he was seen as an outsider. He shuddered when it was his birthday to think about how he would feel when he was 30, and he decided the best thing to do was to get away from birthdays. And he decided to mark the anniversary of his arrival on Earth by travelling to his end. He said he'd already been to the North Pole, and now he was going to walk to the South. And this was another trek in the company of Walking with the Wounded. He manages to remind us of his frozen penis, because he's been told that the South Pole was even colder than the North. And he laughs about it, saying, how could that be any worse? My dick's been frozen, in effect. And this time he said he'd know to take more precautions. Presumably he's going to stock up on Elizabeth Arden hand cream or whatever it was. But apparently he said that he was going to get more padding. And he states, better yet, one very close mate hired a seamstress to make me a bespoke cock cushion, square, supportive. It was sewn from pieces of the softest fleece, and enough said. Well, that's the first time that you've railed yourself in, Prince Harry, when talking about your nether regions. He then explains that in between preparations for heading to the South Pole, he sits down with his new private secretary, Ed Lane Fox, who he calls Elf. It's now November 2013. He gives us a bit of a description about who Elf is and where he's come from, and then he explained that he was the perfect person to help him with the International Warrior Games. And he was going to involve in the creation of that somebody called Sir Keith Mills, who'd organised the 2012 Olympics. Next up, he's talking about a sitting room, and he describes it as he invites Sir Keith to come and have a cup of tea. He explains what he wants to do, and he says that Sir Keith listened respectfully, and then once Harry had finished, he ummed and he ahed. But he explained that he was semi-retired and was trying to cut back on projects, and he wanted to focus on his passions, such as the America's Cup, which, for those of you who don't know, is involved in sailing. And he explained he was about to go on holiday, but Harry thought, well, how am I going to get a man involved who's about to go on holiday and wants to maintain his state of being semi-retired? So he went on, and he decided that the point of the games was never give up. So he decided he wasn't going to give up. And so he kept on at Sir Keith, and then eventually he started to ask, who've you got involved? And basically he realised, of course, they hadn't managed to trick anybody else into joining. And therefore he asked, when are you going to do this? And he said, in 10 months' time. And they wanted the games to coincide with the commemorations of the First World War. And apparently Sir Keith would consider the proposal. Again, these matters are just given some gloss, and it'd be more interesting to hear in the preparation and what it all meant to him, rather than just sort of glossing over these matters. I think if something had been done separately, talking about his career in the military, and then, of course, the impact of the military on him and the Invictus Games thereafter, as a separate book, that would be rather interesting and would give further insight without the distractions, the silly frippery of frozen penises. And whilst no doubt Harry thinks that makes him relatable and it's entertaining and amusing, it just makes him look like a doofus. He moves on, and he's now at the Antarctic, and he's landed at a research station, and it was 35 degrees below. And he said they spent a couple of weeks of loading up on carbs, quaffing vodka, and then eventually climbed into a plane and flew to the ice shelf to refuel, and then landed on a solid flat white plain as if in a dream. He explained there was nothing to be seen in any direction but a handful of giant fuel barrels. He explained how silent it was. There was no smells, there was no wind, there was no birds, no cars, no trees, and he'd never been anywhere that was so peaceful. And he said he was overcome with joy at such peace, and that months and months of anxiety passed away for a few minutes. And then he remembered that he'd broken his toe, and he did this at a boys' weekend in Norfolk, and he dropped a heavy chair with brass wheels onto his foot as a consequence of partying until dawn. He could barely walk, but he was determined not to let the team down. He explained that he kept the pace with his fellow walkers, 9 hours each day, pulling a sledge that weighed about 200 pounds. It was hard for anybody to gain traction on the snow, but it was particularly challenging for him on these slick, undulating patches carved out by the wind. Sastrugi, apparently, was the Norwegian word for these patches, and trekking across the Sastrugi with a broken toe, well, he wondered if that might be an event at the International Warrior Games. He explained that if he had any temptation to complain, he only had to look at his fellow walkers. He was directly behind a Scottish soldier named Duncan who had no legs, and behind him was an American soldier named Ivan who was blind. And he said that he wasn't going to whinge as he looked around and saw the circumstances of the other people with him. Again, denoting his emotional empathy for those individuals. And it's quite interesting, isn't it, that whilst he is somebody that does complain, once again, when he's in the circumstances of those less well off than himself, he shuts up about the whinging. Though it's interesting, of course, to note that these days that seems to have passed him by because he whinges about everything. I wonder who has influenced him to turn on the whinging. Could it be someone who has an eternal view of victimhood? Who might that be, I wonder? And he was explaining that he'd been told to use this opportunity to clean the hard drive, the repetitive motion, the biting cold, to use the nothingness, to make it like a meditation. And he told himself to stay present, and it worked. He fell into the loveliest trance, and even when his thoughts were dark, he was able to stare at them and watch them float away. He considered various challenges that had been involved in his life and realised life was one long walk. He then talks about the dizzies. The South Pole is high above sea level, about 3,000 metres, so altitude sickness is a real danger. One walker had been taken off the trip already. He said that he had head spins, a crushing migraine, pressure building in both lobes of his brain. He didn't want to stop, but it wasn't up to him. Basically, his body gave up. His knees went, his upper torso followed, and he hit the snow. Medics pitched a tent, laid him flat, gave him some anti-migraine injection in his bum, he recalls. And then when he came to, he felt semi-revived, and he wanted to find a way back. The pole was not far away, and it was time to make camp. He then learned that you can't camp at the pole, you had to camp nearby in the shadow of the pole. But nobody could sleep because they were too excited. There was some drinking and horseplay, and then at first light on December the 13th, 2013, they stormed the pole. And on or near the exact spot was a huge circle of flags representing the 12 signatories of the Antarctic Treaty. And he said that there was some press accounts that one of the soldiers took off his leg and that they used it as a tankard to guzzle champagne, which sounds about right. Harry recalling that he drunk booze out of many prosthetic legs in his life. And then he explains that beyond the flags stood a really ugly building, which was a windowless box which had been built by the Americans as a research centre. And it broke his heart to see such an ugly building dominate the landscape, but they went in and they were all starving, but unfortunately the cafe was closed, so they had a glass of water and they were given a test tube which had a tiny cork in the top, and on the side was printed "cleanest air in the world." So Harry makes it to the South Pole, and again it's only given a chapter, and you'd have thought there's such an arduous trek and all the people that would be on it also might be covered in greater detail, the stories of the soldiers that accompanied him, the adversity that they overcame, but again it's just shunted to one side. And it's these things which merit greater examination compared to the whinging and whining about his mother and the complaints that have been made about security and so forth. And I think it's another missed opportunity to sell Prince Harry doing things which would cause people to admire him. Probably, of course, affected by the wife, because she doesn't want it to be lingering too much about him and his achievements, because it isn't about her. And of course she's waiting in the wings to be mentioned in Spare, and she wants that to be about her rather than everything about him. He's been badly advised again. There was an excellent opportunity for Harry to be shown in a better light. But now he's back and he's at Sandringham. Join me in the next chapter to learn more.